On the morning of April 18th, 1976, before the first meadowlark called across the prairie, water was already creeping to the north fence line of a 240-acre farm outside Shelbyville, Shelby County, Illinois. It moved quietly, not like a river, not like a storm, more like a decision someone had already made. Walter Briggs watched from the porch without speaking. At 72 years old, he had learned that panic rarely changed the direction of water. His boots rested beside the screen door instead of on his feet. He was drinking black coffee from a chipped enamel cup his wife had bought in 1958. The year corn sold for barely enough to cover seed. Another inch, then another. By sunrise, nearly 40 acres of newly planted ground lay beneath muddy water. A pickup rolled onto the county road. Behind it came another. Neighbors climbed out, pointing toward the flooded field. Someone had opened the drainage gates upstream during the night. Nobody needed to say it aloud. Everyone knew whose land would suffer. Walter finally stood. His hands were broad, scarred, and permanently stained with grease that no soap had ever completely removed. Those hands had rebuilt engines, stacked hay, buried parents, welcomed grandchildren, and planted more than 40 harvests on the same ground. He didn't curse. He didn't shout. He simply walked toward the water. By 8 o'clock, the county road was lined with trucks. Among them sat a new half-ton pickup, wearing dealership plates. Its owner stepped out wearing polished boots that had never sunk into spring mud. His name was Evan Mercer, 34 years old, recently appointed regional development manager for construction company awarded contracts throughout central Illinois. He studied the flooded acres with folded arms. "That's unfortunate," he said. Someone beside him nodded. Walter kept walking. The younger man watched the old farmer enter water that already reached his knees. "You can stop?" Evan called. "It's finished." Walter didn't answer. He kept moving until he reached the middle of the flooded field. There, beneath brown water, he planted both hands on something invisible. The crowd exchanged confused looks. "What is he doing?" someone whispered. Walter disappeared for a moment beneath the surface. When he stood again, his hat was gone. His shirt clung to his shoulders, but his expression hadn't changed. He brushed mud from a rounded piece of iron barely visible beneath the water. Only then did several older neighbors recognize what lay buried there. Not scrap, not debris. History. Let me tell you about Walter Briggs. He bought his farm in 1949, just after returning home from military service, using a combination of savings, a government loan, and years of labor on neighboring farms. Money stayed tight. Machinery stayed older. Nothing was replaced simply because something newer appeared. If it still worked, Walter repaired it. If it broke, he learned why. If a neighbor needed help, he crossed the fence without asking who would repay the favor. People often called him stubborn. Those who knew him better called him dependable. Those who knew him best understood there was almost no difference between the two. The most valuable thing Walter ever owned wasn't the farmhouse. It wasn't the land. It wasn't even the cattle. It was a 1952 John Deere Model R diesel, purchased used in 1961 from a retiring farmer in Christian County for $2,650. Its twin-cylinder diesel engine wasn't the fastest in the county. Its paint had faded long before Walter bought it. The seat springs squeaked. The steering wheel carried tiny cracks from years beneath the summer sun. But every winter, Walter changed every fluid, cleaned every fitting, checked every bearing, and stored it inside the machine shed. He believed machines remembered how they were treated. Most people laughed when he said that. Walter never argued. He simply kept maintaining them. Now, decades later, that same machine rested beneath floodwater, hidden inside an old equipment shelter built into the edge of a drainage bank years before anyone imagined nearby construction projects would alter the flow of spring runoff. Evan Mercer didn't know any of that. He saw only an elderly farmer standing waist-deep in muddy water beside what looked like useless iron. He shook his head. "You can't save junk," he muttered. Walter finally looked toward him. His voice carried across the flooded field without effort. "It isn't junk. Nothing more. No speech. No anger. Just 4 quiet words." The men gathered along the road looked from Walter to the water. None of them realized that beneath the muddy surface rested not only an old tractor, but the one machine capable of changing everything before the week was over. And the first movement came from somewhere beneath the water. The ripple spread outward in slow circles. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Walter kept both hands beneath the muddy water. Feeling along cold steel, he knew better than the back of his own hand. 40 years of maintenance had taught him where every bolt belonged. Every casting mark rested. Every lever stopped. He wasn't searching. He was confirming. The machine was still there. He nodded to himself. "Bring me the chains," he called. An older neighbor, Harold Jensen, didn't hesitate. He hurried toward a weathered flatbed trailer parked beside the gravel road and returned carrying 2 heavy logging chains that had seen decades of harvest seasons. Evan Mercer frowned. "You honestly think that old tractor is worth saving?" Walter looked up calmly. "I know it is." The younger man folded his arms. "My company has excavators that cost more than this entire farm." Several men chuckled. Walter only smiled. "Then let's see which one starts first." The laughter faded. No one expected an answer like that. "Let me tell you about the John Deere Model R." Introduced in 1949, it was John Deere's first successful diesel tractor for row crop farming. Its 2-cylinder engine wasn't built for speed. It was built for steady pulling power. Farmers respected it because it delivered torque where it mattered, at slow engine speeds, when a plow or wagon demanded every ounce of strength. Walter had rebuilt its injection system twice. He had replaced the clutch once. Every winter he coated exposed metal with oil before covering it with canvas. Machines like that rewarded patience. They punished neglect. Harold and 2 neighbors waded into the flooded field. Together they cleared branches and debris from around the buried tractor. Bit by bit, its familiar green hood emerged beneath layers of silt. A faded yellow wheel appeared next. Someone in the crowd whispered, "I haven't seen one of those running in years." Walter heard him. "It'll run." Evan laughed. Not a cruel laugh, a confident one. The kind that comes from believing the outcome is already decided. "You really believe that old thing's going to save this farm?" Walter answered without raising his voice. "I believe it'll do the job it was built to do." The construction manager looked around at the gathering crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a grin, "if this tractor starts today, I'll personally apologize to every person standing here." The spectators laughed again. Even Harold smiled nervously. Walter didn't. He simply tightened another chain around the tractor's front axle. Have you ever believed in something everyone else had already given up on? Maybe it wasn't a machine. Maybe it was a person, a dream, or even yourself. Those are the moments that reveal whether faith comes from evidence or from experience. By late afternoon, a bulldozer eased toward the edge of the flooded field. The operator waited for Walter's signal. Walter raised one hand. The steel cable tightened. Mud resisted. Water swirled. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, the tractor shifted. Only an inch, but it moved. The crowd stopped talking. Walter nodded. Again! The cable tightened once more. This time the old Deere broke free from the suction of decades of packed clay with a deep, echoing sound that rolled across the flooded field. It wasn't the roar of an engine. It was the sound of history, refusing to stay buried. And as muddy water poured from the engine housing, Walter noticed something no one else had seen. The exhaust pipe had been capped before storage. Someone many years earlier had prepared this tractor to survive exactly this kind of day. Walter quietly smiled. For the first time since sunrise, he believed the old machine still had one more chapter left to write. The tractor spent 3 days inside Walter's machine shed before anyone tried to start it. No shortcuts. No miracles, just careful work. The mud came off first. Buckets of warm water loosened the clay packed into every corner of the frame. Walter removed each inspection plate, drained every fluid, and wiped every gear with clean shop towels until bare steel appeared again. By the end of the first day, the concrete floor looked more like the bottom of the flooded field in a workshop. Evan Mercer returned every afternoon. At first, it was curiosity. Then it became something else. He stood quietly near the doorway, watching Walter work, without rushing a single step. "You're taking longer than I expected," Evan admitted. Walter smiled without looking up. "Machines don't care about our schedules." He continued tightening a bearing cap. "They only care whether we respected them." That sentence stayed with Evan. It was the first time he had ever thought about machinery as something more than equipment. Let me tell you about Walter's father. In the autumn of 1953, long before diesel pickups and satellite-guided combines, Thomas Briggs taught his son a lesson that never appeared in any owner's manual. "If a machine works for you all year," he had said while greasing the front axle of an aging tractor, "you owe it one quiet winter in return. Every November, work stopped for maintenance. Every fitting received fresh grease. Every bolt was checked. Every belt was inspected." Neighbors sometimes laughed at how much time the Briggs family spent preparing equipment that already seemed to run perfectly. Thomas always answered the same way. "The breakdown you prevent never makes a newspaper." Walter had never forgotten those words. By Friday morning, the engine was ready. Fresh oil, clean fuel, new coolant, every line inspected. The old battery had long since failed, so Harold rolled over a heavy 12-volt replacement borrowed from another tractor. The cables clicked into place. The shed fell silent. Even the birds outside seemed to disappear. Walter climbed slowly into the cracked steel seat. His boots settled onto familiar pedals polished smooth by decades of work. He rested one hand on the steering wheel. The other reached toward the controls. Evan stood beside the doorway with folded arms. "I still don't think it'll fire." Walter simply nodded. "That's fair." He opened the fuel, checked compression, waited, then pressed the starter. The engine turned once, stopped again. A slow metallic rhythm echoed through the shed. Nothing. Someone sighed. Walter waited another minute. He adjusted the fuel setting by less than an inch. Tried again. The starter groaned. A puff of gray smoke drifted from the exhaust. Then another. One cylinder caught. A second later the other answered. The old diesel settled into a deep, deliberate idle that filled the building with a sound nobody under 40 had heard in years. Nobody spoke. The machine did it for them. Evan lowered his arms. "I don't believe it." Walter looked over with the faintest smile. "You don't have to." Outside, neighbors began walking toward the shed as the unmistakable rhythm echoed across the fields. Children who had never seen the tractor running stared wide-eyed. Older farmers smiled as though greeting an old friend. Walter eased the tractor into first gear. It rolled forward under its own power. Not quickly, not dramatically. Steadily, exactly as it had done for generations. Have you ever watched someone prove a point without raising their voice? The loudest victories are often forgotten. The quiet ones stay with us because they are earned inch by inch, season after season. Later that afternoon, county engineers arrived to inspect the flooded drainage channel. Their measurements revealed something unexpected. The temporary diversion built upstream during a construction project had narrowed the natural outlet far more than the approved plans allowed. Heavy spring rain had nowhere to go except across Walter's fields. The flood had not been inevitable. It had been preventable. Evan read the report twice, then a third time. Finally, he removed his cap and walked across the muddy yard. "I owe you an apology," he said. Walter looked up from wiping mud off the tractor's fender. "You owe yourself one first." Evan frowned, for assuming experience had nothing left to teach you. The younger man stood quietly for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I think you're right." Walter reached into the toolbox mounted beside the seat and handed him a grease gun. "Good." Evan looked confused. "What do I do with this?" Walter smiled. "Start learning." And for the first time since they met, the two men worked side by side without another word, unaware that the county's final decision on the flooded land would change both of their lives forever. The county hearing took place on June 2nd, 1976, inside the Shelby County courthouse. There were no television cameras, no reporters from Chicago, just folding chairs, stacks of engineering drawings, and farmers who had taken a day away from planting because they believed what happened to one field could someday happen to theirs. Walter Briggs arrived wearing the same brown work jacket he had worn for years. He carried no prepared speech. No lawyer walked beside him. Only a weathered folder filled with maintenance records, drainage maps, handwritten rainfall notes dating back more than 20 years, and faded photographs of the farm taken every spring since the early 1950s. Evan Mercer arrived a few minutes later. He looked different than he had weeks before. The confidence was still there, but it had been tempered by humility. When the county engineer presented the final report, the conclusion was unmistakable. The temporary drainage modification installed during the construction project had redirected floodwater onto Walter's property beyond what the approved plans allowed. Responsibility was shared. The county ordered the drainage system restored to its original capacity and approved compensation for the damage to Walter's crop. The money helped, but that wasn't what mattered most to Walter. After the meeting, Evan walked outside and found the old farmer standing beside his pickup. "I laughed at you," he said quietly. "I did it in front of everyone." Walter nodded. "You did. I thought old experience had nothing to teach modern equipment." Walter smiled. "And now," Evan glanced toward the farm in the distance, "now I think the smartest machine in the county is the one cared for by the smartest hands." Walter extended his hand. Evan shook it. Nothing more needed to be said. Let me tell you about what happened next. The following spring, Evan volunteered to help organize a county workshop where retired farmers demonstrated maintenance techniques to younger operators. Attendance was small the first year. By the third year, every seat was filled. Young mechanics learned how to diagnose problems by listening to an engine instead of plugging the computer. Farm families share repair methods that had been passed down for generations. Walter never called himself a teacher. He simply answered questions. People kept asking them. The old 1952 John Deere Model R never became a museum piece. Walter refused every offer to sell it. "It's still earning its keep," he would say. Each autumn, it pulled wagons during harvest. Each winter, it started on cold mornings with the same slow, familiar rhythm. Children climbed onto its steel seat during community farm days. Grandparents smiled because they remember hearing that same engine decades earlier. The scratches remained. The faded paint remained. So did the pride. Years passed. Walter slowed, but the routine never changed. Every November, the tractor was washed. Every December, every grease fitting received fresh lubricant. Every January, the engine was turned by hand before the first start of the year. It wasn't maintenance anymore. It was gratitude. Walter passed away peacefully in 1988 at the age of 84, leaving the farm to his daughter, Sarah Briggs, who had grown up driving that same tractor across the family fields. She modernized where it made sense. She invested in safer equipment, improved drainage, and more efficient harvesting methods. But every year, on the first day of planting, the old John Deere Model R still rolled out of the machine shed. Not because it was the fastest, because it reminded everyone where the farm had come from. Evan Mercer remained in construction, but he never forgot that spring. Whenever younger engineers dismissed the concerns of local farmers, he stopped the conversation. Then he told them about a flooded field outside Shelbyville, about an elderly farmer who never raised his voice, about a machine that had survived because someone believed maintenance was an act of respect. Many thought it was just a good story. Evan knew better. It had changed the way he listened. Decades later, visitors still asked about the faded green tractor parked inside the Briggs machine shed. Sarah would smile, place a hand on its hood, and say, "It reminds us that taking care of something is never wasted time." Some visitors admired the steel. Others admired the history. The family admired the example, because the greatest inheritance Walter left behind wasn't land or machinery. It was patience. It was discipline. It was a quiet confidence that comes from doing ordinary things extraordinarily well year after year, even when no one is watching. Some machines outlive the people who built their memories into them, but it is those memories, not the steel, that keep them running. If this story reminded you of someone who fixed instead of replaced, who worked quietly instead of seeking attention, or who taught you the value of caring for what you already had, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Those stories deserve to be remembered just as much as the old tractors and fields. And if you like another true-to-life rural tale, the next story follows a farmer who uncovered a forgotten steam engine beneath an abandoned barn floor after nearly 50 years. It's a remarkable journey, and I hope you'll join me for it.